Ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about one of the most powerful dynamics in attachment psychology. Why avoidants, no matter how hard they try, can never truly stay away from the super empath. They may run, they may withdraw, they may shut down emotionally, but somehow, they always come back. They always circle around again. They always find their way back into the orbit of the one person they once pushed away. And this isn't coincidence. It's not accidental. It's rooted deep inside their attachment system, an emotional pattern they don't fully understand, but they feel it every time they think they've escaped. Because the truth is, avoidants aren't running from you. They're running from themselves, from the vulnerability you awaken in them, from the feelings you reflect inside them. And the super empath, the deeply intuitive, emotionally attuned, compassionate soul, is the one person who triggers everything they've spent their entire life avoiding: emotional closeness, intimacy, emotional reflection, and the terrifying possibility of being fully known. When a super empath enters an avoidant's life, they bring something the avoidant has never truly felt before: emotional safety. And this is the very thing avoidants crave the most yet fear the deepest. Avoidants don't withdraw because they don't feel anything. They withdraw because they feel too much and don't know how to handle it. Their entire attachment system is built on protecting themselves from emotional overwhelm. But the super empath, with their calm intuition, their gentle presence, and their ability to read people without judgment, creates a space where vulnerability doesn't feel like danger. It feels like relief. And that relief is powerful enough to pull an avoidant back, even after they've run away. Avoidants are used to relationships that trigger their defense systems. Most people demand more closeness, more communication, more emotional expression than the avoidant can comfortably give. So the avoidant retreats. They shut down, pull away, detach emotionally, and protect themselves behind silence or distance. They feel safest when no one is depending on them emotionally because dependency feels like pressure. They fear that closeness will expose their imperfections or force them into emotional depth they don't know how to navigate. But when they meet a super empath, something different happens. The super empath doesn't pressure. They understand. They don't react with insecurity when the avoidant withdraws. They respond with groundedness. They don't chase aggressively. They stay emotionally stable and perceptive. This balance of closeness and independence is extremely rare for an avoidant to experience. For the first time, they feel like they can breathe inside a relationship. The empath doesn't suffocate them, they soothe them. The empath doesn't demand emotional confessions, they allow emotional unfolding. And the avoidant senses this even if they cannot articulate it. Emotional safety is not created by grand gestures, it's created by presence. It's created by the empath's ability to regulate their own emotions, instead of handing that responsibility to the avoidant. It's created by the empath's natural gift to sit with someone's wounds without poking them or judging them. Avoidants often grew up in environments where their emotions were dismissed, where vulnerability led to pain, where their attempts to express needs were ignored or punished, so they learned to avoid emotional closeness to avoid hurt. But with the super empath, they feel something they've never felt before. Permission to feel. The empath's emotional stability becomes a container where the avoidant's fears don't explode but soften. The avoidant begins to experience moments of openness without panic. They may let their guard down without realizing it. They may share things without overthinking them. They may show affection without feeling trapped. And the moment an avoidant feels safe enough to be real, even for a second, that moment bonds them deeply because emotional safety is the rarest experience in their world. The irony is that while the avoidant may run from the empath, they can never fully detach from that sense of safety. When they leave, they initially feel relief because avoidance is their default coping mechanism. But once the emotional numbness fades, once their nervous system resets, something begins to ache inside them. They begin to miss the ease they felt with the empath, the non-judgmental energy, the emotional sanctuary they didn't know they needed until it was gone. They may not name it as safety, but that's exactly what they're longing for. What the avoidant experiences with the empath is a form of intimacy that doesn't feel like suffocation. It feels like peace. And peace is addictive. Peace is unforgettable. Peace is rare. When the avoidant meets other people, they quickly realize that most relationships feel stressful, demanding, emotionally chaotic, or overly intense. They don't feel understood. They feel analyzed or pressured. They don't feel seen. They feel inspected. And slowly, the avoidant starts comparing every new connection to the calm they once felt with the empath. This is why avoidants always return. Not just to the person, but to the safety. They return to the space where they didn't have to hide their fears. They return to the presence that grounded them. They return to the one soul who instinctively knew how to hold their emotional chaos without amplifying it. They return to the only place where intimacy didn't feel like danger, where closeness didn't feel like loss, where vulnerability didn't feel like exposure. Emotional safety is the avoidant's oxygen, even if they don't realize they're suffocating until they lose it. And the super empath, whether they know it or not, becomes the one person who breathes life into the parts of the avoidant that fear connection yet crave it desperately. That is why they can't stay away. They're not chasing the empath. They're chasing the feeling the empath awakened in them. The feeling of finally being safe in love. Avoidants spend their entire lives hiding behind emotional walls. They build identities around independence, logic, and self-control. They tell themselves they don't need anyone, don't rely on anyone, and don't want to be vulnerable with anyone. But the truth is, beneath all that emotional armor lies a heart that desperately craves connection. Only they've been conditioned to fear it, and this is where the super empath becomes impossible to forget. Because the empath doesn't just care, they see. They see the avoidance fears, not just the behaviors. They see the childhood wounds behind the emotional distance. They see the longing behind the silence, and being seen like this, genuinely, gently, without judgment, becomes addictive to someone who has spent their whole life trying not to be seen at all. Avoidants don't trust easily. They learned early that vulnerability comes with consequences. Maybe they were ignored. Maybe they were criticized. Maybe they were punished for showing emotion. Somewhere along the way, they learned, if I show too much of myself, I get hurt. So they hide behind distance. They show only the parts of themselves they can control. They reveal nothing that could make them feel exposed. But then they meet the super empath. Someone who doesn't need explanations to understand them. Someone who can sense what they're feeling without being told. Someone who can feel their emotional temperature, even when the avoidant tries to mask it. To an avoidant, that is both terrifying and magnetic. Most people misunderstand avoidance. They take their coldness personally. They get offended when the avoidant pulls away. They react with anger or insecurity. But the super empath reacts differently. Instead of panicking, they observe. Instead of accusing, they intuit. Instead of chasing, they hold emotional space. This non-reactivity confuses the avoidant because it breaks every pattern they're used to. People either cling to them or criticize them when they withdraw. But the empath does neither. The empath simply understands. They don't punish the avoidant for their fear. They recognize it. They don't make the avoidant feel wrong. They make them feel seen. They don't push for more. They allow the avoidant to unfold at their own pace. And for the first time in their life, the avoidant feels emotionally understood without being exposed. It's a feeling no avoidant has words for, but they experience it in their nervous system. Their anxiety softens around the empath. Their defenses lower without being forced. They feel calmer in the empath's presence, more grounded, more regulated. Even if they don't consciously realize it, their body does. Because the empath understands them without demanding anything in return. And that is something the avoidant has never known. Love without pressure, connection without force, intimacy without intrusion. Being understood is a powerful human need, and for avoidants, it's even more profound because they never expect to experience it. They assume no one will ever get them. They assume people will try to change them, fix them, or force them into emotional closeness they're terrified of. But the super empath does the opposite. They love through acceptance, not expectation. They understand the emotional freeze without taking it personally. They understand the silence without assuming rejection. They understand the distance without assuming disinterest. The empath sees the avoidance wounds and responds to them with compassion instead of criticism. Avoidants don't forget that kind of understanding. They may run from it because it scares them, because it activates parts of them they don't know how to handle. But even while running, they carry that memory with them. They compare every new person to that empathic presence. And no one else measures up, not because the empath is perfect, but because the empath connected with the avoidant's truth, not their mask. Most people fall in love with the avoidant's surface, their independence, their intelligence, their self-sufficiency. But the super empath sees their inner child, the wounded part that hides, the part that aches for connection but doesn't know how to reach for it. This becomes the avoidant's emotional imprint. The empath becomes the person who understood them without needing them to explain. And once an avoidant has been emotionally understood at that depth, they cannot forget it. They may try to deny it. They may try to suppress it. They may try to distract themselves with new people or new situations. But nothing feels the same. Every new connection feels shallow. Every new person feels distant. Every new relationship feels like work instead of ease. Because no one reflects their inner truth the way the super empath did. And that reflection becomes a pull they cannot escape. Not because the empath chased them, but because the empath awakened in them something they didn't know existed. A longing to be seen, to be safe, to be understood without judgment. They don't come back because the empath begs. They come back because the empath connected with their soul in a way that bypassed all their defenses. That connection becomes the emotional home they never had, and the home they keep returning to, no matter how far they run. Avoidants spend their lives running from their own emotional depth. They fear intimacy, not because they're incapable of it, but because it activates parts of them they've spent years suppressing. They learned early in life that emotions are overwhelming, unsafe, or unreciprocated, so they buried them under logic, independence, and detachment. But when a super empath enters their world, something inside them wakes up. Something they didn't plan for and don't know how to control. The empath doesn't just offer affection, they activate emotion. They awaken softness. They spark vulnerability. And this awakening terrifies and attracts the avoidant at the same time. Avoidants live in emotional survival mode. Their nervous system is trained to stay guarded. They don't allow themselves to feel too deeply, because deep feelings remind them of past pain, abandonment, or emotional neglect. So they form relationships that stay on the surface. They enjoy companionship without true intimacy, attraction without openness, presence without connection. They choose partners who won't challenge their walls. But the super empath doesn't play along with these shallow dynamics. They see depth, they feel emotion, they speak in truths that avoidants don't know how to handle, and the avoidant finds this terrifying precisely because it feels real. The empath activates emotions that the avoidant has kept frozen for years. Suddenly, the avoidant feels warmth where they're used to numbness. They feel connection where they're used to control. They feel seen where they're used to hiding. This emotional awakening disrupts the avoidant's identity. They've spent so long being the self-sufficient one, the emotionally detached one, the one who doesn't need anyone. And now, in the presence of the empath, they feel something powerful, longing to be understood, longing to be close, longing to be safe. And longing is the avoidant's greatest fear because it means giving up the illusion of independence. The empath doesn't force these emotions out of the avoidant, they naturally evoke them. They create a connection where the avoidant feels calm, grounded, and emotionally regulated. The avoidant starts feeling things they thought they weren't capable of: affection, tenderness, compassion, vulnerability. And for someone who's spent their entire life avoiding emotional intensity, the empath becomes both the safest and the scariest place to be. The avoidant feels drawn in, pulled closer, unable to resist the emotional gravity of the empath's presence. But here's the paradox. The same emotional awakening that draws them to the empath also triggers their instinct to run. Avoidants fear losing control, and feeling deeply makes them feel exposed. They're afraid that if they let these emotions grow, they'll eventually get hurt. They'll eventually have to rely on someone. They'll eventually have to be vulnerable, and vulnerability feels like danger to them. So even though the empath awakens their ability to feel, the avoidant may still push them away, not because they don't care, but because they care too much and don't know how to handle it. The empath becomes the only person who activates this emotional depth in them. Others don't reach that place. Other relationships stay comfortable, predictable, emotionally shallow. With others, the avoidant feels safe because they don't have to confront their inner wounds. But with the empath, they can't hide. The empath intuitively knows when they're scared, when they're overwhelmed, when they're shutting down. The empath doesn't just see who they present themselves to be. They see who they truly are beneath the layers. And that level of emotional recognition is something the avoidant can't replicate with anyone else. Even when they run, the avoidant remembers how they felt with the empath. The emotional awakening stays inside them. They may try to numb it. They may try to distract themselves. They may jump into another relationship. But nothing activates them the way the empath did. They miss the emotional electricity, the intuitive connection, the sense of being known without words. They miss the version of themselves that only comes alive around the empath. The version capable of warmth, closeness, and emotional depth. That version of themselves feels good, even if it scares them. This is why they can't stay away. They come back because the empath reminds them of their hidden emotional capacity. They come back because the empath awakens what's real. They come back because the empath stirs the part of them that wants to feel, even when fear tries to shut it down. The avoidant doesn't just crave the empath. They crave the emotional aliveness the empath awakens inside them. And that emotional activation becomes the pull they can't resist, no matter how hard they try to run from it. Most relationships trigger an avoidance defenses because people naturally want closeness, reassurance, consistency, and emotional involvement. But avoidants can't handle those expectations. They feel smothered, overwhelmed, or trapped. Emotional demands activate their deepest fears of losing independence or being hurt again. So they do what they've always done: pull away, create distance, shut down, or detach. But with the super empath, something different happens. The empath provides exactly what the avoidant's nervous system needs: closeness without pressure, warmth without overwhelm, love without intrusion, connection without suffocation. This balance is extremely rare. Most people swing too far in one direction. Either they chase the avoidant anxiously or they get offended and pull away in anger. The empath does neither. They understand space. They understand emotional rhythm. They understand the avoidant's need for autonomy, not as rejection, but as a protective response. And this understanding creates a relationship environment the avoidant has never experienced before. One in which their fear does not get triggered by connection. Avoidants are drawn to this balance because it allows them to feel connected without feeling controlled. The empath doesn't suffocate. They don't ask for constant reassurance. They don't demand intimacy before the avoidant is ready. They don't make emotional demands that feel like obligations. Instead, the empath gives the avoidant something they secretly crave, but can never admit: emotional space wrapped in emotional safety. When an avoidant withdraws, most partners become upset. They ask questions, want explanations, seek reassurance, or interpret the distance as a personal insult. This makes the avoidant retreat even further because conflict or emotional intensity overwhelms them. But the empath responds with grace. They sense the avoidant pulling away and they don't panic. They don't chase. They don't pressure. They simply remain steady, calm, grounded. They give the avoidant the time they need to recalibrate without taking it personally. This lack of pressure is like oxygen to an avoidant. It's the emotional breathing room they've longed for but never received. They start to relax instead of brace for impact. They start to feel safe instead of defensive. They start to trust instead of anticipate rejection. The empath's energy is soothing to the avoidant's nervous system, and once the avoidant experiences a connection that doesn't trigger fear, they never forget it. Avoidants are accustomed to relationships that feel like emotional tug of war. One person wants closeness, the avoidant wants space. One person wants communication, the avoidant wants quiet. One person wants depth, the avoidant wants distance. But with the empath, there is no tug of war. The empath doesn't pull, they don't demand, they allow. They don't overwhelm, they understand. And because of this, the avoidant feels a level of peace that is rare and unforgettable. The empath's balance of emotional closeness and autonomy also helps the avoidant maintain their sense of identity. Avoidants fear losing themselves in relationships. They fear merging into someone else's emotional needs. They fear becoming responsible for another person's happiness. But the empath doesn't put that kind of weight on them. The empath remains emotionally self-regulated and independent. They don't rely on the avoidant to save them, complete them, or fix them. This reduces the avoidant's fear of enmeshment, making the relationship feel safe rather than suffocating. For the first time, the avoidant experiences connection as something that enhances their freedom, not threatens it. They begin to realize that closeness doesn't have to cost them their independence. The empath shows them that it's possible to be deeply connected without being emotionally entangled in a draining or overwhelming way. The avoidant feels seen, understood, and safe, all while maintaining their autonomy.